It's been 1 year since the Constellation Alpha took its place as a centerpiece of my setup, and guys, I have to tell you, this is an incredibly solid stick even at its price point. I had promised previously to give a review and my thoughts on the Constellation Alpha once I had used it for a while, so I think this now qualifies. This stick grip is often hailed to be the king of flight sticks when it comes to space sims, but how does that hold up after 1 year of use? Let's get a history of the last sticks I've used and the setup environment to give some context to this review and the use case. The most recent stick setups I've used in my right hand are the Thrustmaster Warthog using the Warthog base, the Virpil MT50 CM2 on the Virpil Warbird base, and finally the Virpil Constellation Alpha on the same base. I also have a custom modified Constellation Delta for my left hand that acts as an omnidirectional throttle. Be sure to check out the linked video in the description for more information on how that works. My sticks are both connected to Warbird bases attached to custom mounting brackets and use the heavy spring set. I use pedals, and so the twist axis on the Alpha has been locked out by the hex screw at the bottom of the grip. I don't find I miss the twist axis on the grip because the number of other controls that I have at my disposal, and I prefer to have the stick stay centered on the twist axis, even if it's not in use, as it improves stability on the X and Y axes. Depending on your setup, you might want to leave it unlocked so you can twist it freely, as it is still quite accurate. I have found that if you want the twist to be locked out, you do need to exert quite a bit of force on the retention screw to make sure it won't slip. The first few times I attempted to lock out the twist, it felt solid when I first tried it, but I had to go back after about a month or so to retighten it so it wouldn't slip, and have the stick twisting when I didn't want it to. So really, tighten this real tight if you want to make it stay solid. On the Warbird base, it is a decidedly huge improvement over a base like the Thrustmaster Warthog. The accuracy and smoothness of the gimbal, cams and springs here really makes this stand out. Although this is going to be true for just about any grip mounted on these Virpil bases, not just the Alpha. Over the last year, I have used the Constellation Alpha primarily in 2 games, Star Citizen and Planetside 2. Respectively, that's one that can be considered more designed around joystick controls, and one that requires a fair bit of work to be truly compatible with a full joystick setup. I actually think this is a good thing, as you can compare 2 different flying styles from my gameplay footage, and I think this is especially relevant when looking how the grip holds up through various motions in comparison with the 2 games, especially as it relates to strain on your hand. If you want to find out more information on how it works for Planetside 2, check out the video I've linked below where I go over setting up sticks for use there. If you want to look at my control bindings for Star Citizen, check out the video I've linked below for that. Alright, with those caveats in mind, let's look back at how well the Constellation Alpha has served me over a year of use. Perhaps one notable feature of the Constellation Alpha that helps define it as a stick for space simulation is the analog mini-stick located at the top of the stick. This gives 2 additional control axis inputs in the form of a stick that you would more or less find on a traditional gaming console controller. Under the mini-stick is another button, just like you'd find on the console controllers, by pushing the stick in. The mini-stick is smooth to operate and feels nearly identical to a console controller, but the actual quality of the rubber top is not quite up to par with what you'd find on a modern console controller. Namely, it's a harder rubber and it seems to degrade much faster. I've also found that the same rubber on the mini-stick that's on my Constellation Delta, which I've owned for longer, has begun to degrade and worn down fairly quickly. This means it's losing that shape that makes it similar to the Xbox style sticks. I've ended up covering both the mini sticks on the Delta and the Alpha with rubber caps because of it, to help preserve their life. The placement of this mini stick is unfortunately not as good as on the Constellation Delta. The centered mini stick on the Delta makes it far easier to use and be accurate with movement, because the mini stick on the Alpha requires a much further reach with your thumb. It's possible to raise the hand rest on the Alpha to make this easier, but I find this makes the lower thumb hat and pinky switch harder to operate. Where I use the Constellation Delta mini stick all the time for FPS style movement when not in vehicles, this has prevented me from upgrading the Delta to an Alpha in my left hand. As of this video, the Constellation Delta is also discontinued by Virpil, so unfortunately if you don't already own one and want it for this purpose, then the only option is going secondhand at this point. That said, it is still usable, but perhaps not as accurately or as easily as on the Delta. I have set it up in such a way that it controls external cameras in third person, and have assigned the upper and lower limits of the mini-stick to act as additional buttons. This lets the mini-stick also operate like an additional hat switch. That way, you can still functionally have four-way hat switches on the Alpha, but also still have it act as gradual input for functions that can accept analog bindings. The grip of the Constellation Alpha is made of plastic and held together by metal screws. The palm-facing side of the stick also has a knurled pattern on it, which aids in holding onto the stick with a solid grip and for using the twist function. The grip diameter on the Alpha is larger than that on the MT50, and in my hand it feels about the maximum size I would want a grip to be. I have found that over extended play sessions, it does cause my hand to feel a little bit more tired and cramped than on a smaller diameter grip such as the MT50. However, it's nowhere near as bad as the grip on the Warthog. With the Warthog grip, I found it was almost a requirement to use gloves, which you might expect given the Warthog is a replica and made of metal. However, there are no such issues for me with the Constellation Alpha. The addition of a flanged nut on the handrest gives it far more stability than the loose and floating handrest that is found on the MT50. As I mentioned with the mini-stick, depending on your hand size, you should be able to find a position that is good, but the reach of some of the furthest controls might conflict with the higher and lower positions of the rest. The two-stage trigger on the Alpha is made of metal, so it feels solid as you pull through it without any flex on the mechanism. There's a distinct feeling of the internal switches for each of the stages, so you can easily tell which ones have been activated by feeling alone as you pass through them with the trigger partially and fully depressed. Generally, I bind each stage of the trigger to a weapon group, allowing me to conserve ammunition on the second stage, or to better time slower firing but heavier hitting guns with automatic fire on the first stage. The flip trigger on the Alpha is in line with the two-stage trigger, effectively making the entire assembly a singular three-stage trigger. I both like and dislike this. For my situation, I have set up the flip trigger being depressed to stop head tracking so that when firing, my view is always centered. However, on the MT50, the flip trigger can be activated with your middle finger independently of the main trigger, allowing it to operate some other distinct function. In Planetside, as an example, is the way of independently activating weapon optics without actually firing a weapon. Effectively, it would also allow you to fire another weapon group without firing the first. Depending on what you intend to use this for, you might be better off with something like the MT50 style of flip trigger, just so that you have that extra layer of independent control. The Constellation Alpha has 3 4-way hats with push buttons, 1 2-way hat with a push button, 2 additional buttons on the head of the stick, a button beneath the mini-stick, a 2-stage button press on the scroll wheel, a pinky switch at the bottom of the grip, and a virtual button that's activated by fully squeezing the analog brake lever. All of the buttons and hats feel good to use, with a clickiness and tactile feedback that makes any accidental activation of the buttons virtually non-existent. The 2 buttons on the head of the stick and the pinky button are all identical in shape, size, and activation response. However, I've had a few issues with the CMS thumb hat. This one feels a little more squishy than the others and sometimes doesn't do exactly what I feel it should do and can be a little more sensitive to picking up an input that I did not intend. Most notably, I find that I can accidentally press down on the hat when I'm actually trying to press right. It's not something that I've experienced with the MT50 CM2 or the Warthog. It's not something that happens frequently, but it does happen. The 2-way hat on the side of the stick is easy to reach, and thanks to the shape, easy to move in either direction with your finger or to push in. The scroll encoder on the Alpha is 2-stage, unlike the Delta, which is only 1 stage. Both scroll encoders on the Alpha and Delta scroll up and down and can be pushed in to activate a button, but The alpha can be pushed in past the initial button click to get an additional button. This is useful for things like selecting, locking, and pushing through the second stage to unlock a selected target, all without needing to move your thumb from a singular control input. The analog brake lever is metal, so it feels solid to use, and is an improvement over the plastic one on the MT50 CM2. I do wish it was slightly longer and had more of the same shape from the MT50 CM2 though, although this is only a minor issue. The lighting on the stick can be customized just like on the Constellation Delta. If you're not a fan of lighting, it can be disabled, but I like the lighting, so I've made it match the color scheme of my pit. The lighting can be configured within the Virpil software, and so can a number of other functions, including binding axes to buttons, changing calibration, and setting up controller curves. I know some people find the Virpil software a bit confusing to use, but I find with a little bit of use it's not bad, although I do have a more technical background, so that might be helping me. The Constellation Alpha is the best control stick for a space sim that I've used, and it feels like an incredibly solid choice. However, it isn't without a few flaws. If there was another model of a Constellation series released in the future, I would change a few things if I were in charge. Firstly, the mini stick would take a more centered design like on the Constellation Delta. This is where it should be if it is intended to be used more frequently. This would go a long way to making the stick truly capable of delivering on a large number of analog access inputs that are easily accessible for space sims. For me, the physical size of the grip could be a bit smaller, more like the MT50 style, just to make it easier to use over longer sessions. I feel like the grip size on the Alpha right now is simply that way, just so that it has more of a sci-fi flair. I feel like those are minor flaws though in what is otherwise an outstanding grip, because you get an impressive array of buttons, hats, and analog inputs. Most importantly, you get to add them to a solid Virpil, Mongoose, or Warbird base. Thanks for tuning in for my thoughts on the Constellation Alpha. If you want to see more of it in action, subscribe to the channel and check out the gameplay footage where I use it on a regular basis. There's a lot of gameplay content and setup videos where I go over bindings and control options. If you have questions about the Constellation Alpha or my setup, be sure to leave a comment, or check me out on Twitch and have your question answered live.